Hello there, I'm Ron Lemon, and this is Level Up with Lemonade, a side mission. The last two videos in the Bridgman series, covering the definitive guide to figure drawing from life, which is an anatomy book more than it is a figure drawing book. These last two videos are on the hands. This is the largest part of the book and it's packed with information, so I needed to divide this into two videos so that you're not watching a 3-hour plus video on this information, which you'd probably never get through the end of it because of how much information there is. Breaking it up into two sections, I think, was a really smart idea for covering all the information he gives us. We're going to be going over the historic usage of the hands, symbolic gestures and poses of the hands in illustration and fine art, and the anatomy. I've also provided several demonstrations breaking down the drawings to help you understand how to study from them, making them a little bit more accessible and easier to work with. Because when we're looking at a finished product, we have a really hard time sometimes trying to figure out where did that artist even start. Hopefully the demonstrations help you with that. Because hands are so complex looking, we have a tendency to avoid studying them and using them in our art. My hope is that this video and the second video will give you enough confidence and help you access the information with greater ease to start your own studies and start putting them in everything that you make. They shouldn't be avoided at all. I mean, they are the second actor of the body. This being the first, these being the second, where strong emotions are emoted through. We don't want to miss out on making strong art. We want our art to be as powerful and as useful as possible in telling the story that we're trying to for the audience. And when we avoid certain aspects of the art, it just weakens the messaging altogether, and we don't want that anymore. Not to mention, they're not difficult to draw. They're just smaller shapes. That's all it is. All right, with a lot of information to cover, I don't want to keep you waiting. So let's dive right in and get started with the first part of this chapter. This video should have been out sooner, but because this section is so large, I had to figure out what I was going to do with it. And so the idea now is that it's going to be broken up into two parts. This first part is going to be more of the functionality, while the second part is going to look over the different areas of the hand as far as the shape language is concerned. The first 4 pages of this chapter are probably the most important 4 pages in the entire book. They go over the reasons why we do the drawings that we do, especially in particular the hand designs and what the hand symbolized throughout art history. Now, it doesn't cover all of art history, but it gives us a glimpse into Bridgman's thinking and his knowledge of art history, and why certain things were done the way they were during different periods of art. We begin this whole chapter with this first image, which I don't think is Bridgman's. There's 2 reasons why I don't think it's one of Bridgman's. I think it's one of his students. One, the shading under the wrist is really not very well handled and does not conform to the planar structure of it as well as all of his other drawings do. And secondly, the thumb is skewed in this drawing. It's not straightforward in terms of its construction. There's a skewing taking place in the fingernail as well as in the knuckle of the distal segment. And so because of those, I'm thinking that this is probably from student notes. But regardless, his examples do not exemplify all that he is describing in this particular section. I have some information about a few periods of art that he mentioned with a little bit more in-depth detail about them. And then I'm going to show you some images that relate to specific artists as well as specific time periods. He begins this section by describing that we've built art and made art all the way back to cave dwellers. And the hand in particular is an interesting subject within each of these different periods of art. Sometimes it's symbolic, sometimes it's functional, sometimes it's fashionable. Understanding this, though, really does make a big difference, especially when we go to a museum and we look at all these different art pieces and we question our own art abilities and what we're trying to do with the tools that we're learning. It gives a really good, clear indication of what we should be thinking like when we're making art. Now, as we progress through here, some of the drawings that he does are very reminiscent of, say, like these two hands here look very much like Peter Paul Rubens, who was a big influence on Bridgman, and the design language that Rubens would use. Notice that is no vascular and no tendons on the top portion of the hand, which is called the dorsi portion of the hand, and that the knuckles and the fingers are very clean and smooth. He and Van Dyck, his protege, were not painting for just anybody. They were painting for royalty. They were painting for the wealthy. The design that they use in their work reflects the type of person and the social status that they were painting into. And there's a little section in here that I want to read verbatim because I think it's really important for all of us to understand this as well. It may be reflected that the science of anatomy is a comparatively new or recent acquisition of the race. It is not many decades since the cutting up of the human body was forbidden by law and abhorred by religion. Even after such a study is well developed, it takes a certain time for its significance to penetrate to other domains of thought and effort, and a much longer time for it to be assimilated there. It has taken man centuries to learn to look under the form for the mechanisms in the human body, and he is only now learning to look under the mechanisms for the reasons that underlie them. The world of art is beginning to appropriate these things to itself, and the improvement in one man's technique by this means compels others to seek improvement in the same school, the school of nature, her reasons and her purposes. If this tendency to fluctuations, to styles and fashions is more marked in the hands than any other part of the body, it's probably because the importance of the hand as an avenue of expression has not been understood. The hand is thought of as the slave of action, but the slave of action is the master of expression. I'm going to focus on specific eras that he quoted in here, and I'm going to give the style that was attributed, hand poses, and their function, as well as some visual examples to go along with them. For the Byzantine era, the style is highly stylized and symbolic rather than anatomically accurate. Hand poses often were oratorical gestures or hieratic scale. Oratorical gestures, 2 or 3 fingers raised, often seen in Christ or saints, signifying teaching or blessing. Hieratic scale is an emphasis on hand gestures to convey divinity or authority. And the function of those hands was communicative and sacred, used to convey spiritual authority rather than physical realism. And as far as the visuals go, long, elongated fingers, flat forms, and minimal anatomical detail. In the classical Egyptian period, hands were rigid, formulaic, profile-based representations. The hand poses were palms facing down towards the viewer, often holding objects like ankhs or staffs, and they were gestures of offering or reverence. The function was symbolic and ritualistic, used in narrative friezes to convey actions or roles. And the visuals were usually hands shown in clear, simplified shapes. All the fingers are usually the same length and sometimes really stretched out. In classic Mayan art, they are intricately detailed with an expressive gesture language. The poses are open palms, pointing, holding ritual items, or bloodletting tools. Specific mudras used to denote rank, power, or ceremony. The function usually conveyed social status, myth, and ritual through gesture. The visuals were stylized but dynamic, often exaggerated for emphasis. In the Gothic art period, the style was elongated, expressive fingers, and emotionally driven. The hand poses were expressive gestures of sorrow, prayer, or awe. Virgin Mary and saints often have delicate, prayerful hands. The function is usually for emotional and devotional meaning. Hands guide the viewer's spiritual response. And the visuals are typically slender, elegant hands with long fingers, often unnaturally posed for clarity in the storytelling, so more symbolic. The The Renaissance period was anatomically precise, naturalistic, informed by the study of human form. The poses are natural resting poses, gestural communication, or complex overlaps. Often interact with objects like books, instruments, tools, and so forth. And the function, humanistic and expressive, used to show thought, action, and personality. The visuals, mastery of foreshortening, since perspective was a big deal now, tension, and gesture. Leonardo da Vinci's studies of hands are a good example of this. The golden age of illustration, which was around Bridgman's time, since Bridgman isn't going to cover the artists of his time and he's going to be talking about these previous artists, I wanted to make sure to get this one in, since this was probably the most important period of art for U.S. art history. The style is realistic yet theatrical, influenced by both classical and romantic traditions. The hand poses are usually expressive, dynamic, and narrative-driven, or the emphasis on silhouette for clarity in a black and white reproduction. The function is to evoke drama, character, and mood in the storytelling. Visuals like Howard Pyle, N.C. Wyeth, and J.C. Leyendecker used hands as emotional focal points. And then lastly, I also picked the modern era of manga and anime, since this is a huge influence within the last 20 years or so for almost anybody coming up trying to be an artist. The style is highly stylized, ranges from realistic to exaggerated. The hand poses are signature gestures like peace signs, hand seals, power-up poses, symbolic or expressive actions, covering the mouth, clenched fist, or open palm. The function is to enhance character identity, emotion, and action, iconic in defining personality. And the visuals vary by genre. Shonen equals exaggerated action, shoujo, delicate emotion. So there is also these attributes that are culturally related within the gestures. I also want to take a moment to point out a few artists that weren't on that list, just to kind of give you a visual understanding of some of the differences in the artists and not just the art periods. So we have Botticelli, which is, again, exaggerated length in the fingers, not a lot of anatomical detail to them, but very form-driven. Van Dyck and Peter Paul Rubens were both involved in making art for the wealthy class and for royalty, which means they are not going to have a lot of design based upon labor-driven intentions. These are going to be hands that rarely see gripping a tool of some kind or doing repeated actions over and over again that would harden and callous the hands. Dürer was one of the artists that liked to depict things in a very realistic fashion, and you can see the fingers are definitely elongated, but the amount of detail that goes into the anatomical structure and the skin folds is quite rich in this drawing. Michelangelo was all about the design. So when you look at his work, the spots of light and dark are indicative of a design language that flows throughout his paintings. They're not just isolated to these areas. They tend to lead your eyes from one spot to another throughout the entire painting structure. Raphael's drawings of the common man. So we're going to see solid, rigid hands that are used for labor. We're going to be seeing more anatomical nuances that feel more accurate to a realistic hand as opposed to stylizing them. Peter Paul Rubens, another lucky artist to have been given the chance to study the human form in a medical, nuanced sort of way, where working on a cadaver or studying from a cadaver, he was given permission to do so. So he has a pretty solid understanding of the knowledge of anatomy as well. But given his subject matter, which were the wealthy class and royalty, he isn't going to be pushing the hands in a direction of these hardened hands of labor. A lot of what he painted was going to be this very supple design, very much like the Van Dyck that we saw already. Rembrandt is a different artist all unto himself. He copied things to look as realistic as possible with all the nuances of realism, all the little details, all of the layers, the vascular, the skin folds, the bone structure showing through the skin, and the heavier finger pads, the stronger fingers, delicate fingers, royalty fingers, everything of its kind. Whoever his sitter was, he tried to portray them as true to who they were as possible. So when wanting to learn something about really depicting something more for its naturalistic approach as opposed to it being highly symbolic, Rembrandt is the guy to look at. Moving into the golden age of illustration and beyond, Dean Cornwell is one of those few artists that I wanted on this list because he was a design master, not just of composition, but of all the elements within his compositions. He was very solid in crafting the design of the human form, and his drawings versus his paintings are very different for most of his career. His drawings were always graphically sound, everything spelled out and designed perfectly for his design in his paintings. And then the painting structure might have varied and changed a little bit, but all of his drawings were worked out right down to the fingernail in how those should look and feel, three-dimensionally sculpted and well designed into the rest of the design grid that he created and crafted. Harvey Dunn's paintings are of these broad-handed, heroic human beings doing the work of the earth. The hands in these pictures are definitely stylized and pushed even larger than life because this is what his subject matter was all about. Norman Rockwell was one of Bridgman's students, and he was a master of theatrical craft. He could design anybody in any given way. It was about the narrative that he was generating. And because he was the Saturday Evening Post artist, the subject matter varied broadly from cover to cover. He was able to capture any type of human being. He understood anatomy very well. He understood the anatomy of drapery very well. And then he was able to push everything in a slightly caricatured sort of manner by pushing it just a little bit more than it actually is. But when it comes down to the finished product, it feels exactly the way it's supposed to. He was a true master at what he did. Andrew Loomis was another student of Bridgman, and when you look at Andrew Loomis's pieces, he was a high society fashion illustrator, so there's not going to be any working man's hands in any of these pictures. Regardless of their age, everything is going to be soft and supple. Everything is going to be streamlined and very clean looking in the design work that he did. Two extremes, Norman Rockwell and Loomis, both students of Bridgman, but both very well versed in what they were painting. And it's obvious when we look over the works that they made. And then finally, here's a few images of anime hands, highly stylized, but very realistic looking, and pushing the gestures larger than life for theatrical purposes. So again, I can't emphasize this enough. This section of the book and the next several pages are some of the most important pages in the book. I would read them word for word and then go do some investigation on the internet and look things up to confirm what you've been reading here. And what I mentioned earlier about the stylization and functionality of the hands, so that you have a better understanding of what it is that you're supposed to do with your work when you make the choices from the studies that you have crafted to understand this information as thoroughly as you possibly can to implement into your work. This next section is also equally important that you read it, and is one of the few sections in the book that actually has an entire page written without any examples on the page along with it. But it is important that these pages are read. He's explaining all the different variations of the hand. In one case here, types of hands may be classified as square, round, compact, long, short, thick, thin. The relative length of the fingers vary, both among themselves and in comparison with the hand. The relative thickness of joint and shaft and fingertips vary. The thumb may be short, thick, or thin, may lie close or spread far from the hand. And then he goes into the differences of the hand from a labor and where it's going to be squared off because the muscles are heavier and the skin is thicker and hardened from usage, which means then that the folds in the skin are going to be much deeper than in a soft hand that isn't used for labor. And then he talks about the psychology There's a wholly involuntary opening out movement of the whole body, limbs and features and pleasant emotions, honesty, courage, understanding, etc. And conversely, there's a closing up, a drawing in, a turning away, an unpleasant emotion in mental dishonesty. So he's in states of self-consciousness and the effort of self-control. There's a tendency to express the same by clasping one's self, as clasping the thumb with the fingers, clasping or twisting the other hand, or some part of the body. He's describing rhetorical poses. He's describing symbolism in the characters that are painted. He's describing the shape language for the laborer versus royalty versus the common person versus the child and the adult and so forth. There's a whole range of descriptions that he's covering here that would otherwise go unnoticed because the drawings are not necessarily portraying those. He does not have in this section a collection of hands that are symbolically representational to each of these different classes of people, but he's describing them in words which again are very important to read because this information, it doesn't exist anywhere else. He is explaining everything that needs to be known about this part of the body and how we portray people in certain instances, which again then makes this section probably the most important section in the entire book. Now, on the following pages, he shows these examples of the softer hand versus the hand of the laborer, where the knuckles and the tendons are going to be more visible. And he's also showing the symbol of each hand without the need of all the details, showing the fist in its different positions from the pinky side to the thumb side, and the tendons that go from the forearm into the hand, how the knuckles and the fingers are tightly clasped when the fist is made, and what kind of strength this hand has over this hand because of the smaller nuances that he's illustrating within it. These last two pages cover the symbols that the hand shapes can make when the fingers are a certain way. Like here we have tongs. To grasp something, the fingers would be drawn this way to show the action that the fingers are about to take. The hand as a hook, and the way that the wrist and the hand and then the fingers act as that hooking device to pick something up, like a pail of water, by its really thin handle. And then a few more expressions of the hand. The hand as a weapon, so the fist, of course, and he's using a spear tip here to sort of show that with the hand at different angles, certain fingers and the knuckles will act as that same shape of the spear tip to create the weapon of choice without an actual physical weapon. Our hands can be one alone. And then, of course, the hands can also be a scoop, to scoop up dirt, to scoop water, to scoop up clothing, or whatever those hands are going to be scooping up. And the shape that all the fingers would make in that scooping position, as well as in the clasp position as it's gripping those things and moving them from one place to another. These first two sections of the chapter on the hands should be read more than they should be copied in the pictures. Of course, each of these symbols should be copied and quickly gestured so that you can also have a library and a language of how the hand can depict so many different tools. But I think it's way more important that you read these 12 pages and really get a good assessment of what Bridgman was describing in the way that we use hands in art and how we should be thinking about them. When you're studying from this section, there isn't really any need to draw these. It's really not necessary. This is basically visually explaining this, and so is this. It's showing you which fingers are active, and in this case, it's showing you which interosseous muscle sits in front of the other, which is what causes the skin folds in this particular image. Now, there's a bunch of extra lines in this, And these lines have to do with how the skin changes from the interosseous muscle to the finger joints and the thumb bones. And then the lines that are in the finger right here show the edge of the form as it's transitioning from the top to the side. So again, understanding what the line work means makes all the difference in the world in how you translate the picture into your own. So we would start with a large shape, or a shape that recognizes a space, a volume, and then bring in the arm, draw the hand. Here are the wrist bones, down to the end of the bones, then over to where the muscles are in the thumb, then the thumb, then the finger. Bring the finger closer to the thumb, and then find the volumes. Find the volume there, find the volume here, find the overlap, find where the metacarpal bone goes for the thumb, find where the metacarpal bone goes for the index finger, find the folds, then bring in the overlap where the bone is versus the fat pad. Find where the tendons of the thumb overlap the wrist, then the tendons in the wrist, the halftones from the transition of the underside to the side plane of the hand, the rest of the thickness of the hand. Then as a layer, I'm going to take this and lighten it up and keep this as sort of like an underpainting. Then put a new layer over the top of it and then redraw the lines. Now I'm really thinking about, let's kind of make this look like the Bridgman drawing. Although this is too short right through here, so I probably need to move the wrist up a little bit. I can do that by sliding this up and giving the metacarpal bone here more length. Then the length, then the bone, then the proximal segment with the fatty pad, then into the hand, the line of the skin fold that separates the interosseous muscle coming from the thumb and anchoring to the side of the finger, separating the bone mass from the fatty tissue, finger pads, the knuckle out here from the end of the proximal segment, the middle segment, and then rolling into the distal segment. Fingernail, and finishing this part off. And I don't need all the extra little hatch lines or anything like that, but it is a good idea to design that entire bone so the bone is visible. And we have a skin fold right here that occurs. So I'm going to keep that the way that it is. Then send this out to the thumb. Find the top of the thumb here. So this is the distal segment for the thumb. Then the fat pad of the thumb. Drop this down into the nail pad, finding the rest of the shape of the nail, and then finishing up the thumb shape on the distal segment. The metacarpal of the thumb. Moving into and I'm just putting hatch lines in here, but I could always use his little swoop, which is framing the metacarpal of the index finger. Then following the rest of the thumb muscles as those turn into the tendons that go to the top, the dorsal side of the thumb. Then the hatch lines that separate the side plane from the underside, tendon into the muscle mass, and so forth. I believe that the line that he has here is sort of indicating the other side of the knuckle. We have the forward edge, and then we have the back part where the proximal segment is connecting to the middle segment. And then we can put in the hatch lines along here to separate the side from the top from the bottom. But these little tiny details go in later. They don't go in first. We want to make sure that the big picture is working first before any of these pieces go in, so that you're not confusing yourself with details over the masses that are important first, the larger masses that make up the body of the hand. And that's how you would use the information. Now notice that it started with a circle and the circle was just for the hand mass here. You don't need to be accurate about what you start with. You just need a starting point so that there's something there visible for you to work from. And then everything else sort of fills itself in as you go. Let's do one more. Let's do the hook. So we need where the hand is going to be placed and then where the arm is going to be in relationship to the hand mass. Now the hand mass can be divided up into angles and so forth, but at least we have a mass there to place it all. Finger, the wrist, the radius bone, and then the pisiform bone somewhere right back around in here where we have the muscle anchoring to it. Then the muscles for the pinky finger, tendons above and below, knuckle, and so forth. I'm going to move this back a little bit because, of course, that hand is a little bit on the large side. Now, oddly, there is absolutely no way that I can bend my finger this way. This is supposed to be the proximal segment, the middle segment, and the distal segment, but I'm trying my hardest and I cannot get my finger to bend like that. Each segment actually wants to curl in this way. I'm going to go ahead and draw my hand in that particular way rather than what he's demonstrated here, just because, again, my fingers can't do what this shows, and I don't want to draw something that isn't the way that it works, at least for me. It isn't the way that it works for me. By having this a little bit more relatable to myself, it makes things a lot easier for me to engage with the information and make good use of it. Now that I have all of the rough in, I'm going to go ahead now and block in the final shapes. So this is the pisiform bone, the tendon that's anchored to it, the muscles in the forearm, the muscles on the side of the hand, then the wrist bones, then the tendons on the top of the hand as those go out to the end of the metacarpal, then the tendons as those go out to the middle segment knuckle, bone, tendon as that turns down into the fat pad here. I'm going to anchor this together, come back here and block out the rest of the wrist. Radius bone. And now we have all of this mass completed. Then we have the fat pads of the other two segments, knuckle, and then a hint of the finger. Bring this up into here, send this back into the hand. This is the flexor side tendon. This is the extensor side tendon. Indications of the metacarpal through here. And we have the hooked hand. If you like the information that you're hearing and if you like the content of this video, if you like the content on this video and other videos that you've watched on this channel, like the videos, share them with others, and subscribe to this channel, or you'll get more videos like this in the future here. That sounded stupid. If you like the content of this video and other videos that you've watched on this channel, like the videos, share them with others, subscribe to the channel, and if you're looking for a challenge, the challenge to actually do the studies and do the work, consider becoming a member of this channel or over on my Patreon page, where I provide you with additional video demonstrations on this content, further breaking it down into a very clear-cut step-by-step guide. In addition, I give you lots of challenges with exercises that you would do using this content and then moving it over to the work that you do or studies from imagery, photos, models from life, and so forth. Thank you very much for watching these videos, making it all the way through the videos, and hopefully the content that you're watching has helped you grow as an artist or grow as a student of the arts and make it a little bit easier for you to study from. I really, really appreciate your support. All right, let's get back into the information. In the third section of the hands chapter, he covers the anatomy. In addition, he also covers the mechanics of the hands. So in this case, he's describing the wrist bones, because in the following pages, he is going to be explaining the movement of the hand at the wrist. So there are 8 bones altogether in the wrist. But what I think is more important is that you memorize the shape of those bones, which is this, and the wrist bones, which is this, basically. A curved surface with a curved surface rolling within it, to understand the movement of the wrist, both from thumb side to pinky side, and how this whole mass right here can roll this way, or it can roll this way within the wrist. In addition to flexing and extending, we have this rolling motion from side to side. And if we look at the bones a little bit more, there are these little platforms on both of these, and there are these little indentations on these bones, which are the limits to the lateral motion of the hand. Because there's those little notches, the bones fit into each other at those notches, preventing the hand from rolling any farther. But the design is built into the bones to prevent the hand from moving too excessively. And then he gets involved in the movement of the hand and the mechanics of the curvature of the wrist and the roundness of the wrist bones, and then shows that wrist in a multitude of positions. In some cases, he overdoes the design work, like this notch is a little too extreme, but he's still showing the bones pronated and supinated, and then shows the range of motion that the hand can roll when the bones are either pronated or supinated. And then he also shows it from profile view, which is what these 2 examples show. All the rest of these are either the dorsal side or the palmar side. And then we have the profile side over here. Then we get into the anatomy, and he starts to break things down in terms of the muscles that are within the hand, which you see here. These are what you call intrinsic muscles. These are the muscles that stay within the hand space. And he's also showing the tendons of the muscles that come from the forearm that pass over the bones out to the fingertips. Here we have what are called the interosseous muscles. These are the muscles that sit between each of the fingers, and these help when we extend or spread the fingers apart from each other, and these muscles settle the fingers back when we relax the hand. Here he's showing the different muscle groups of the thenar and the hyperthenar pads, which are the pinky pad and the thumb pad. The thumb pad is the thenar pad, and the pinky pad is the hyperthenar pad. And this is where all the other muscles sit within the palm of the hand. We either have the interosseous muscles or we have the muscles within both of these different wedges. And then a few pages later, he has all of the muscles named, and a lot of these names are now a little bit different than what they were once called. To some extent, not all of the muscle names have changed completely, but there's definitely some variations on these muscle names now. Like extensor digitorum communis is no longer, this word has been dropped off and it's just extensor digitorum. So going back to this page for just a moment, these muscles here are not named on this page, nor on this page either. And the muscles on this page coincide with these, which are the muscles that come from the forearm and cross into the hand. Like this is the palmaris right here, number 11. If we go back one, number 11 is the palmar fascia. So it's now called the palmaris. Slightly different name, but again, these are the tendons that we see on these charts right here. In the 2 drawings that we have on this side, he has the hand flexed back towards the dorsi side. So we're getting this crease right along in here. And he's showing that that crease is designed by the roundness of the wrist bones. And then when the hand is flexed towards the palmar side, we see a slope that cuts down through those wrist bones. And because these two bones of the forearm are not directly in line with each other, there is a staggering taking place between this corner over here and this corner over here that falls back a little bit further. In this particular page, he's again showing the sloping through here and the smooth transition that takes place from the forearm into the top of the hand. He's also explaining that the top of the hand, for the most part, is a smooth surface. Now, this is on a younger hand, of course. As the person ages, the hand starts to show more and more of the anatomy. Tendons become more apparent. The vascular system becomes a bit more surface-like. And so the expression that he's explaining here has to do with a hand that is younger. Now we go back into more anatomy charts, and he's including the interosseous muscle and the digiti minimi that's within the palm section of the hand, as well as the adductor pollicis, which is right here, and as well the tendons that are coming from the forearm, the thumb muscles that come from between the radius and the ulna, and then the rest of the extensor muscles coming from the forearm. You can connect the numbers to the words down here. If I was to sketch this drawing right here, I would also include the forearm so that you know which muscles each of these tendons belongs to. I think it's more important that you can connect the dots together than just seeing this cropped version and making an educated guess as to what the shape of each of these muscles are that we're only seeing the tendons for, including the fact that these tendons go all the way out to the fingertips, but he doesn't show that. He's just showing the intersection as things are passing over the wrist. And here he's showing the tendon of the thumb as it's extending all the way out to the thumb tip, and showing how the tendon passes over the knuckles of the fingers as it heads out to the fingertip. Here he's showing two different sets of tendons, the one that goes straight down through the middle of the finger and the ones that wrap around that, to show where the passages are for those tendons and the design of those tendons as they're sitting underneath the flesh. And I'm not really sure what this one corresponds to, since he's not showing any of the tendons within that little drawing. What he's explaining here within both of these is the way the wrist is designed. The thumb side of the wrist is larger. So between the radius and the ulna bone has this large angle designed into it, like so, where on the pinky side, this is lower. Because the thumb does a lot of the work, the side of the wrist has to be a lot stronger in its design. And then he's also describing how the tendons of the hand start a lot further forward towards the knuckles than all the way back into the wrist visually for younger hands. But for older hands, you can see those tendons all the way down into the wrist. And he's explaining that the flexing of the hand is a more important attribute to the hand than the extension of the hand. So when the hand is in extension, you're not seeing the tendons as much as when the hand is flexed. You're going to be seeing them very sturdy looking and taut because of how they're securing the hand for that particular position. And in opposition of the back side of the hand, the dorsi side, we have the palm side of the hand. Here he's explaining that in the palm of the hand, the highest point of the palm is where the middle finger is positioned. That's the highest point within the palm space. And then we have the different pads. We have the thenar pad and the hyperthenar pad. In this particular drawing, he's sort of combining those muscular pads with the bones underneath to show where they cover the bones. And then several examples of the hand in various positions, most of them in a grasping position of sorts, and showing how the palm pads look and how the tendons from the forearm flexors intersect those pads in these flexing positions. For a drawing like this where we have the anatomy and we also have a fleshed over version, it might be a good idea to join the two of those together to create one demonstration out of the two parts. So the first one, of course, would facilitate the silhouette of the finished drawing, which will then put the pieces inside of. We want a space where the hand is going to fit into, and then an extension for the arm. Determine how lengthy the metacarpal is, in addition to the wrist. You sort of need to separate the two of those out. They're not all one and the same. There is an extra length for those wrist bones. Then determine where you're going to place the extension of the fingers, the flow, and the overlap. Very similar to how we worked on the first demonstrations. Kind of thinking about that really basic design before adding any information into the design. Then the other finger, which doesn't turn right here at the end segment in this way, unless you're just talking about the very last segment, the distal segment of the middle finger, in which case it can't angle at this particular angle. Think about this. George Bridgman was drawing these demonstrations above his head on a large piece of paper with a piece of charcoal attached to the end of a 6 or 8 foot length piece of bamboo. When he's drawing these lines, he's being very graphic about everything. He's not being nuanced in the details. So there's always going to be something that might just be a little off, and that's perfectly okay. Just as long as you understand that there are some things that need to be changed. In any of these drawings, I would do the hand position first with your own hand to understand what it is that you're actually building. Once you understand that, then it makes things a lot easier to build out and know what you're dealing with in terms of the line work. So the overlap in the tendons in the wrist, the interosseous muscle mass through here. Actually, I need to bring this forward right here, somewhere around inside of here. The metacarpal bone design, proximal segment, then the middle segment, then the distal segment, down to the fingertip, knuckle, knuckle. And then the same thing with the thumb. We want to be able to locate where the metacarpal is before we get into the proximal and then finally the distal segments. The overlap along here where the skin folds are. Move this up a little bit and over. Find where that knuckle's going to go. Find where the fingernail is going to go. Elevate this line just a little bit more so that the finger isn't just this little tiny shape. And then block in the two segments for the middle finger. Wrist bones, tendon, forearm flexors, side plane, and this is all the underplane. And then along here, the forward edge and surface, the volume of the interosseous muscle, and then all the rest of the information that we can now proceed forward and block in with a little bit more conviction. I'm going to take the layer, lighten it up a lot, put in a new layer, and then begin the dissection. So across this bone right through here, we're going to have some tendons. These tendons are going to go up this way, and they're going to go back this way. Smaller tendon here, larger tendon here, longer tendon here rather. Then the second tendon, as they converge through this part. The retinaculum as it goes over the wrist. That's the band, like a wristband that holds all of the tendons in place. Tendon, and then the tendon along here as it goes up and over the metacarpal into the top of the finger. Finish that length, create a little circular intersections to the retinaculum, and each one of these is going to have one. This anchors to the thumb. And I need to change the direction of that. It's going in the wrong direction there. It's going to be coming this way. Here we have the interosseous tendon and then the other interosseous tendon along here, as that goes and anchors to the proximal segment, which is this bone right along here. Metacarpal, the interosseous muscles, as the one is passing over the top of the other here. The skin fold, anchoring this to the proximal segment, then bringing these up and through, over the knuckles, which I'm going to do a draw through here to make sure that I center everything appropriately. And this goes towards the end of the finger where the nail sits over the top of that. The end of the thumb, the fat pad, the length of the bone. This changes direction right across here, so I want to make sure that this is lifted up enough. The metacarpal for the thumb. And I'm going to bring this forward just a little bit, making sure that it's not too exaggerated in length. And then separating out those planes. Then the muscles going into the wrist. These are the muscles that sit between the radius and the ulna bone. And there are two of them. This can also be a little bit narrower here. The length of the arm, tendon of the muscle as it's passing over both of these. More tendons. Tendons within the flexor group, the shading for that muscle, and then the negative space that sits in between all of those. This I can actually lower just a little bit and then block in each of the different sets of tendons as they pass underneath. Now I'm going to come back through here and clean a few things up. Side plane. The underside of the bone along through here, tendon as it anchors in, and I'm going to put some lines over the tops of these to show their volume. Then I'll come back in with the previous drawing and block out the fat pads accordingly. Fingernail, knuckle, knuckle, and then the other finger as it passes behind. And that's how you would combine the information together, starting with one drawing, finishing with the other drawing, the one that's maybe a little bit more important, and then label everything according to how you need to label it so that you know what you're actually looking at in your own drawing. It might not be a bad idea. I'm going to go ahead and number these in the way that he did. And then I'll block out all the information that's necessary. But make the design work that you do when you're studying from somebody really count and really matter. If you're not labeling things, you're just drawing a bunch of lines. By the end of your drawing, you may not know what you drew. And I think it's really important not just to copy the picture, but to understand what it was that you translated from that picture. The next 12 pages of the book have to do with the construction of the hand. Now, the construction of the hand is a combination of the anatomy as well as the shape language of the fingers and the palm and the dorsal side and so forth. So he's getting involved now in his language of how he drew his own pictures, the machination of the hands and the mechanical shapes that make up the hand. It is important to read these sections, but I think it's almost more important now that you start copying the pictures and really breaking things down based upon the visual descriptions that you're given. Here we have all of the different muscles in the palm of the hand. He has one that is anatomically laid out, and then he shows one that's a little bit more fleshed over. These shapes are not necessarily elegant. These are heavily constructed to show all the nuanced changes that are taking place within each of the different sections. And he has, in this case, the pinky finger muscles removed, and he's showing the annular ligament, which is the ligament that goes across all of the tendons that come from the forearm to hold those down, and how that ligament is attached to these particular muscles over here. The muscles on the pinky side sit on top of that ligament as well, but he's taken them away so that we can see what sits underneath. This muscle right here actually looks a little bit more like, if we have the fingers here, and these are the bones in the hand, this muscle is coming from the middle finger bone right here and attaches over here to the thumb. In this case, it looks like a ball shape, but it actually is not a ball shape. It's a wedge-like shape that sits underneath both of these muscles right here. And both of these muscles are separated from one another through here. He's not visually separating them from each other, but they are separated. There's two separate muscles there, the abductor pollicis and the flexor pollicis brevis. Both of those are, the abductor is to take the finger and move it away from the hand, and the flexor pollicis is to flex the thumb inward this way. That's the two opposing actions those two particular muscles take. Now, he actually does have the muscles drawn over here, but he's pushed the annular ligament over the top of them. Both of these muscles are also wedge-like, like this. In fact, in another book, the Stephen Rogers Peck book, he describes these sections as teardrops. We have three teardrops of the hand. We have the teardrop shape here, the teardrop shape here, and if we look at the hand from the pinky side, there's the teardrop shape of those same muscles, but in profile view. So it's the same teardrop for both of these, but we would consider them three different teardrops because there are muscles to the outside over here as part of this group, and they also have the same shape as the muscles that we see here that are heading up towards the pinky, from the wrist to the pinky. So now in this page, he's describing the shape language of the thumb side of the hand. We have the thumb mass over here, but we have the interosseous muscle that sits along in here that creates another shape. There's the thumb, there's the index finger, and then there's this mass that sits in between them. And then with this, he's also showing that the tendons of the thumb overlap into the wrist this way, which is an important attribute to help connect the hand to the forearm when you're drawing it. Just making sure that there's a little bit of a wedge along in here to show those tendons crossing over into the thumb. And it's the tendons from the thumb muscles that are passing through that particular section. In this particular example, he's showing the tendons that are coming from the thumb muscles in the wrist. And he's explaining the length of each of these tendons, which is the long extensor, the short extensor, the long abductor, and each of those tendons as they reach out to the thumb bones for the action of the thumb. And we have a fleshed over version up here so that we can see what portions of those tendons actually show through the skin. On this page, he's explaining that even though we have these tendons that are coming from the wrist, which are long tendons, the power of the thumb is in the short muscles within the hand. So the intrinsic muscles within that space are the power and the strength of the thumb. And we see those both below and above the tendons that are passing from the wrist out to the thumb tip. He's also now describing things in terms of Bridgman planes. He's not going to be making things in perfect blocks or perfect cylinders. He's combining the shapes together. So anywhere you see the shading that's taking place is a separate plane. This is all the top of the hand. This is all the side of the hand. this is all the underside of the hand, and we can see all three of those planes simultaneously. You can also see the different breaks in the planes out in the fingers. Even though he's not drawing the fingers this way, he is explaining that particular instance. And then down here, he's doing that same thing, but he's using his hatch lines to show the various planes and their position in space based upon the direction the lines are traveling in. Those are his cross contour lines that he's famous for with his drawings. And again, the construction, we can see that all of these forms down here are nice and block-like. And of course, the literal blocks that he's turned the fingers into. And then up here, those same blocks, but with the organic structure of the bones and the tendons. And he's still going on about the power of the thumb side and these two particular masses of muscles, which are called the short muscles in the hand. And that's where all the power of the thumb comes from. The long muscles are not power muscles. It's the short muscles that are. And all of those short muscles are intrinsic to the hand shape. And then we have various examples, both masculine and feminine. The masculine examples are going to have a lot more detail and information, while the feminine and the youthful hands are going to be devoid of most of that information. They're going to be smoothed out and rolling more in transition, but you can also see how he's blurring and blending the interosseous muscles with the block of the hand. He's not making them separate in these particular examples, but he is really pushing them in these more masculine versions. And here he's breaking down those muscles again, and he's giving names to them. And here we can now see the adductor transversus in its entirety coming from the middle finger, where in that previous example, he had it mostly covered up by the rest of the components within the thumb section. More construction, more plane breaks, and you can see the bulk and the masses that he's pushing. Now from the thumb side, we slide over to the pinky side and the more delicate nature of the pinky side. So he's also saying here that the thumb side of the hand is known as the pulling side of the hand, while the pinky side of the hand is known as the heel side of the hand. Since the pulling is much more important, a function of the hand, the thumb side of the hand and wrist, and all of the bones of that side with the first two fingers are much larger. So again, the thumb side is where all the action takes place, and the bulk of the hand is going to be in those particular areas, while the pinky side is going to be slimmer, thinner, smaller, not as bulky altogether. Now, it's kind of hard to see this because the drawings are so harsh, but the pinky side of the wrist is more angular when the wrist is flexed towards the palm side of the hand. It's a much sharper angle here, where the thumb side rolls more. It has more transition to it. It's the larger side, and it's the side where all of the tendons pass from the forearm into the hand. So it also has to have a more slope or curved surface so those tendons don't get pinched. But this side, being the heel side, is a much sharper, more deliberate and sharpened shape language. And then in the wrist, the pisiform bone is the last bone on the wrist side. And it's this bump right here, and right here. It's where the tendon of the flexor carpi ulnaris attaches. And we can see that both over here and over in this instance over here. And the pisiform bone is sort of a ball-like bone. You can feel that in your hand. That is where the tendon here attaches, and that is where these muscles depart and move up towards the rest of the hand. So again, when the hand is at an angle, it's that little tiny bone that creates the change in direction from the wrist into the hand. In this particular instance that he's talking about is these two drawings down here. When a hand is resting flat against a surface, the pisiform bone is going to be very distinct, and you're going to see the muscles from that particular bone splaying out and kind of having their own shape next to the pisiform bone. But you'll see both of those at the same time within the hand. you're not going to, this bone is not going to be covered up by the muscles on the pinky side. And then the last page within this section is the anatomy. Now, again, he doesn't draw the separations of these muscles. These muscles are separated through here. There's two different muscles through here. Both of them are separated. The pisiform bone, or the anchor, the flexor carpi ulnaris, as it attaches to the pisiform bone, and then these muscles as they're coming from the pisiform bone into the pinky. This pad over here is smaller than this pad over here. And from the pinky side, we are going to see that pad as the breaking line between the thumb side and the pinky side of the palm of the hand. So there should always be some kind of line that divides the two sides in the palm of the hand. And this line is more important than the line that's up here that covers this fatty tissue that covers all of these bones up along in here. This line is the more important division line to draw within the hand. And he's also being very deliberate about the plane breaks and having the underside versus the side plane showing. There's a plane break along here as well, and we traverse across the hand in such a way, but he doesn't have it described in that particular way in this one, but he does over here. He shows those divisions between the top of the hand, the side of the hand, and then this break for the bottom of the hand. Now, I don't want to build on any redundancies here. With the last one, I demonstrated the tendons and the muscles in the hand. And in this case, I want to start with the skeletal mass and then flesh it out over the top with the semi-fleshed over, semi-muscular system that he has in this particular drawing. So as usual, we want to first start with a mass and then link the wrist, extend the finger, and then the fingers. Finally, the thumb. Make sure that everything is legible. Find where that hypothenar pad is going to go in reference to the finger. Find where the other fingers are going to be relative to it. Looking at the negative spaces, this thumb could move over a little, so somewhere to about right here. The thenar pad over here. The wrist, the pisiform bone, the flexor carpi ulnaris, then the other tendons as they're passing over the wrist. Making sure that these connect together visually. Looking at each of these segments and thinking about them dimensionally. Separating the two of these out even though he has not, and then removing the excess that's just going to crowd the space and make it a little bit on the messy side. The bone end, the underside, side plane, underside, underside. The blurring of the two fingers, the thumb pad itself, the joint, hypothenar pad, thenar pad. Now I'll take this, lighten it up. If you're doing this traditionally, obviously you can't lighten things up, but what you can do is put a piece of tracing paper over the top and then draw either on the tracing paper or take another sheet of paper and stick it over the top of the previous loose drawing and use the thickness of the paper, kind of like a piece of tracing paper, to wash out the harshness of the dark lines so that you can fill in and finish your final piece. So now we have the ulna bone over here. Then we have the radius bone through here, because those are going to be translated as well. So our ulna bone and the length of that bone. The little bump on it, the wrist bones, and the radius bone. Send that back into space. The wrist bones, the metacarpal for the thumb, then the proximal, then the distal. And his shading. Then swing this up and over towards these fingers. We have the pisiform bone here, then the metacarpal, the proximal, the middle, and the distal. Now the other fingers behind this aren't so easy to see. The other wrist bones through here. Their lengths. And then the third finger. And the separation of the top planes from the bottom planes, making those a little bit easier to see. So now we have the skeletal mass. I can take the first. I'll keep it there for now because there's still some boundary lines on it that are important to me. Then the new layer. The skin as it falls over the ulna bone. The tendon anchored to the pisiform. The flexor carpi ulnaris. Tendons passing over the wrist, at least the ones that he's chosen to draw. A hypothenar pad. The muscles on the pinky side. Tendon as it passes up and over the knuckle. Second knuckle here. Although that's a bit exaggerated because I think from this angle, you're probably not going to see that at all. The end of the finger, the fatty pads, bottom plane, bottom plane, bottom plane. Then the fingertips on the other two fingers. Then into the thumb. And so forth. Looks like he has the interosseous muscle in there. And then I'm going to block the rest of that out so that it's on the underside. Turn off the first layer so that we can see both of these layers. And we have the skeletal design and then finally the fleshed over design. And this is the way that I would study these particular areas because it makes sense to combine the drawings since he is giving them to you in layers, taking the layers, and especially if you're working digitally or on a piece of separate pieces of paper stacked on top of one another, you can build all of the masses up to create a finished, fully fleshed out armature, skeleton, muscle system, very similar to the way that I block things in my figure drawing masterclass, learning how to put the whole figure together in layers. It just kind of makes sense. The more you separate all the components from each other, the harder it is to think about them combined together. Bringing them all together gives you a complete picture of what's going on. Now, this last demo, we're going to go between the loose and the more developed. And we'll keep it as one picture since they can be combined together in this particular instance. We have the hand mass, the finger out at the end, the wrist as it goes up, looking at the length right here, just making sure that everything feels kind of accurate in terms of its scale. Tendon ramp as it comes down into the hand mass, the pinky mass, and then the other fingers over here. Pinky mass as this drops down. the wrist as it curves underneath, and then the tendons as they curve into the hand. Pisiform bone, the flexor carpi as it's attached to it. Want to make this look flattened out, but I also want to make sure that there's a stair step between the two. And then the other tendons. The rest of that muscle mass as it comes up and over the knuckle, tendon, the fat pad of the proximal segment. And it's practically done already in its design. Bottom of the arm, tendon mass as that's passing up, thenar pad. I'm going to take this, lighten it, just like before. I want to make sure that I have a template that I can draw over the top of as I go to finish things off. The knuckles. Now, because the hand is pressed against a surface here, it isn't going to look as teardrop-like. And then it's just a matter of pretty much just tracing back over the shapes that have already been drawn in. Bring this around underneath. Get the rest of those tendons blocked in. And pretty much finished with the design. Just going to make sure that this is a little bit heavier in scale and that there's a clear distinction between the two pads over here and over here. All right. So this is how you would possibly, or this is an example of how you could possibly work from Bridgman. Layers and stacking. And when the information is very similar, start with the basic shapes, start with the basic information, start with the under information, and then flesh over the top of it using separate layers so that you can kind of go back through all of the drawings and look at the buildup from the underside all the way out to the fleshed over version. I hope these give you some insight into how to study from this particular section. And just because I didn't draw from all of them doesn't mean that there's any difference in the way that any of the other drawings would be done. I would do all of them in the exact same fashion. Give yourself a loose, rough starting point with shapes that recognize the scale of each segment as you're piecing them together. Then a very loose lay-in of those shapes, a little bit more articulated. Really judge the scale of all those shapes before moving on. Once you understand that you can see the shape language at roughly the scale that it's supposed to be, then you're ready to finish things off. As you finish things off, continue to stay loose. Don't draw gripping your brush and pushing down really hard and slow and trying to get the lines really clean. Be loose about everything that you're drawing, and a loose line will look nice and clean and representational as you continue practicing. Just make sure that you don't draw your lines with a bunch of little choppy brush strokes. Try to maintain the lengthiest line that you can possibly draw all at once. It's going to help you immensely in keeping your drawings much cleaner. All right, that ends part 1. I know that was a lot of information. Study from this chapter before you watch the next video. And I'm definitely talking to those of you who will be seeing both of these videos up online. Right now, of course, the second video isn't up yet. But for the future you, study from one video and work with that for as long as possible until you feel comfortable with the information. Then move on to the second video and study from that one. My next series is going to be on the Andrew Loomis books. I'm not sure which one I'm going to start with. There's lots of information there to parse and a lot of information that will hopefully get you started on making better art for yourself. Again, thank you for coming along this journey with me. I hope you've found all of these videos to be useful in some way. hopefully this book is a lot easier for you to work with now, and you can actually study from it without feeling like you don't know what you're doing. And that's my goal in the long run. I hope you found these videos useful for you. Be on the lookout for a new set of videos coming soon on Andrew Loomis. In the meantime, good luck with the work that you're working on. Good luck with your studies. Stay well and stay creative. I'll see you soon. Take care, everyone.